and all of the things just fell into place. There was finally funding. And so I am going to tell you the story of how we took that luck and turned it into a park system. So the first is this very, it looks so dainty because they colorized the picture, but this was the rough and tumble Seattle of its first few decades. Lots of dirt streets. You notice the angled streets. There was lots of confusion about how to do the street system around the bay that took quite some time to sort out and still is not entirely sorted out. And it was a city that was a long ways from anything, not served by railroads in the early years. Not until 1875 or so is when we kind of get regular train service. And so the city of Seattle is the civic leaders are very focused on economic development and on developing the waterfront facilities and sort of that subsistence mindset where we just need what we need to survive and get this city off its ground. There were a few attempts to sort of add some refinements. There were a couple of parks added early on in the 1880s. But, and one attempt in 1892 to actually do a park system. We see that influence of the Olmstead principles that early out in Seattle. Edward O. Schwagerl, who was the superintendent of parks at the time, came up with a park system plan. It did not have the elegance of an Olmstead plan. It was quite broad stroked. And perhaps luckily, it didn't get developed because the Panic of 1893 hit. And of course, that hit the entire country, and Seattle was just brought to a standstill by it, economic development here. And certainly, no one was investing in park landscapes or park land acquisition in those years. Those were the 1890s. But Seattle got super lucky, and way, way north in the Northwest Territories of Canada, gold was found. And these are boxes of gold, not the little pouches that you think of for a gold seeker coming back with his nuggets. These are boxes of gold coming back into Seattle from Alaska. Seattle benefits from being the closest American port city to Alaska and then on to Canada to reach the Klondike River. And so a number of Seattleites figured out pretty quickly that it was more likely you were going to make a fortune by supplying the gold seekers than being a gold seeker. And so you just see this massive influx of capital and people. We have a flood of people. By 1890, we had just 43,000 people, so a nice bustling town. By 1900, we have 80,000 people. That's just 3 years after the 1897 strike of gold in Alaska. And then by 1910, we have 237,000 people in Seattle. So that's a near tripling or a more than tripling of the city's population in just 10 years. And I just really imagine most of these people are coming by boat, and it just must have been a daily flood of people coming across those piers. And so across the city, you see things like subdivisions and transportation infrastructure being built and other elements of city building. And you see industry popping up anywhere they can find some level ground if we have a very hilly city here. And civic leaders realized that the window of opportunity was closing, that as land was being developed, the opportunity to set aside any parkland was quickly disappearing because not only was the land just getting developed, gobbled up for different types of uses, and once it was developed, it was not going to be used for parkland, but also they were worried about the cost of the land because that sort of boom time speculation era meant that the prices were just going up tremendously fast, and there is only so much that they could raise from voters in park levies or in city funds that would allow them to purchase land. And so there was a handful of parks in Seattle prior to this era. We had a couple of them had been private parks. This is Woodland Park, which is now in the Wallingford neighborhood, Phinney Ridge, and it had been a private park, and the city purchased it from the estate of Guy Phinney and his wife, Nellie. The Kinnear Park there on the left, that was donated to the city, and it's perched on the western shoulder of Queen Anne Hill, one of the largest hills in the city. And then in the lower right-hand corner, this is Denny Park, which was on Denny Hill, which in true Seattle fashion is no longer there. We had a city engineer that liked to level hills, and this was the one he most successfully did. It is now a flat park on, it fills a block, but we did have this lovely park on the hillside that had been the city cemetery, but was transformed into a city park, and the bodies were moved up the hill to a different burial ground. And so we have these parks that are open to the public. We also have some private parks at the end of the trolley car lines that are starting to develop what they called suburban areas. They were within the city limits, but they were beyond the reach of the existing residential development, many of them very close to the lakeshore or on the lakeshore. And so there's a little bit of development going on, but public parks do not get developed in the late 1890s because we had the most dysfunctional board of park commissioners. At one point, we had dueling annual reports submitted to the city council because there were only 2 park commissioners who were even pretending to do the work, and they were they did not like each other at all, and they would not attend meetings together. And so they just wrote their own annual reports about what they thought should happen. So naturally, the city council did not give them any money, and nothing happened. And so as city leaders are realizing how dire the situation is getting, that they are going to miss the opportunity to develop a park system, then the mayor takes it in hand. He appoints new people to the board of park commissioners. They tend to be professionals. They tend to be men. They're all men. They're all white men who are used to doing projects and directing people and getting things done. And so they take the ball and start running. And what we see is that they send out a letter to private landowners in Seattle and the people who will be paying the taxes if there is an effort to build a park system with levy funds. And they sent them all letters, and they said, would you be willing to pay for the cost of this that we anticipate? And this is a page from one of our newspapers, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, where it has quotes from all the letters back of course, I would be thrilled to pay for a park system. And you'll notice at the top that we have, let us make a beautiful city of Seattle. And so you have that echo of the City Beautiful movement that had been introduced by Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. in the Chicago World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition in 1893. And people from Seattle's government had traveled east and seen the effect of this movement that was just getting going across the United States as the Panic of 1893 subsided. And so in this newspaper article, the Board of Park Commissioners write that their goal is to have someone develop a comprehensive plan, and they want this to be a prominent landscape firm. They do not name anyone, but that's the wording they use. And they want it to be for a city of 500,000, so about a little more than twice as big as the city would become within the years of this planning process. And they said that their goal was to have all future work done in harmony with that scheme, that park plan, whether done now or 100 years from now. So they're looking at, we need to know what are our goals, and we need guidance from a professional. You know, you see that progressive movement seeping in there also. And so they knew, and this is something that still happens in Seattle, they looked east for sort of that stamp of legitimacy and that expertise, that landscape architecture firm that would develop the park system plan. And partly that was because of sort of a bit of an inferiority complex and wanting to look east for what was going to be respected and would make them a real city. You hear that a lot in the writings, but also so that they could get voters to support the park system. They knew that the Olmsted name was well known enough that they would be able to use that name to leverage support for the park system. By 1903, however, Frederick Law Olmsted had retired. And so his son, John Charles Olmsted, who had worked with him for decades at that point, had started a firm with his half-brother, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. And so they formed the Olmsted Brothers firm. And this is who the leadership in Seattle connected with when they first wrote out east to get an expert to come and work on the park system. And so, like my first graphic showed, this is quite a ways from Brookline, Massachusetts, particularly if you're relying on train travel, which of course he would have had to. And so another stroke of luck that came Seattle's way is that the Lewis and Clark Exposition was planned for 1905. And by the Portland Board of Park Commissioners had already contacted the Olmsted firm and asked them to design the grounds for this World's Fair. And so it was a little easier to draw John Olmsted out to the West Coast because here's two big projects that are waiting for him, and they allowed the two cities to share the expenses and benefit from the sort of economy of scale of having two cities work worth to do to make the trip out here. And so that was incredibly lucky. And John Olmsted also did a plan for the Portland park system. And the 1903, it's the 1903 plan. It is available online, and I encourage you to take a look at it. It's a fascinating read. And so on April 30th, 1902, Olmsted, along with his associate Percy Jones, arrived in Seattle. And this is the group of commissioners, and Olmsted there in the middle with his pipe. They are on the shore of Lake Washington, and they took a tour of the city to get sort of the lay of the land, understand the natural topography and the assets of this region, because of course Olmsted is looking for those elements that are special to Seattle that are going to help him capture that genius of place and design this park system to help people have access to it. And so we're very lucky in the the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site archives. There are a number of photos of that Percy Jones and Olmsted took when they were here. And these are them. And they show you a city that is largely undeveloped. On the lower left there, that is Madison Park, which was a neighborhood. The person who subdivided it developed a private park on the lakeshore there. But the rest of those pictures are capturing Seattle. The one in the lower right is Volunteer Park, which was then known as, which was then largely undeveloped. It had a little bit of a lawn development, but it's largely undeveloped at this point. And you can see how rustic the paths were. It was basically just a nice place to be outside. Not a lot of amenities or design put into it. And so he spends the month of May and most of June here, and he develops a park system plan. This is the best map we have of it, is from the Post-Intelligencer. And you'll notice a few things here, that there are small parks distributed around the city. These are the small little squares you see. There are large parks throughout the city that capture the really amazing landscape of the city. This is a peninsula that extends into the lake and had old growth timber on it at a time when much of Seattle was already cut over by the lumber companies. This is what would become Jefferson Park, and it's on the hilltop, and it has amazing views across Puget Sound. And then this is Puget Sound here. This is Elliott Bay. So this is saltwater. And on this side, this is Lake Washington. This is freshwater, which all of these park properties that you see look across the water, but also capture views of the Cascade Mountains, which is the major north-south mountain range in Washington. Views that look to the west, anywhere along here. Those looked over Puget Sound, but also captured views of the Olympic Mountains, which is the major mountain range that is on the Olympic Peninsula. We are doubly blessed with incredible views in Seattle. And another thing that was important about this plan is that it captured the diversity of landscapes in Seattle. He didn't just go for those sort of obvious places, the lakeshore and the seashore. He also was able to get land acquired around Green Lake, which is now one of the most popular parks in the state. And he was able to capture some of the ravine areas where there were beautiful forested landscapes that could be traversed by Boulevard. And so it's a comprehensive system that encapsulates the whole city, although you will notice that it is more of an arc than a necklace. And that is because downtown, this area here, had already become too developed and too expensive to really justify the acquisition of property, or even to make it possible for a significant park. And so the first landscapes that the Board of Park Commissioners developed are the spaces that they already own. And one of those was Washington Park, which is in the northwest part of the city. Here, I will show you real quick. It is up here. I'm sorry, the northeast part of the city. And this is a large tract of land that was available for park development. And what they asked the Olmsted brothers to do was just to design the boulevard that was going to, it would go through this park and then cross over to the lake shore. And Olmsted, of course, balked at that, because you don't, as he told the park commissioners, you don't design a park for a road, you design a road for a park. But they wanted to get people to understand, the park commissioners really wanted people to understand the possibilities of a park system, and this is what they had money to do. And so Olmsted, you see, made a park plan for a road. And he couldn't help himself. He and Percy made all sorts of notes about what the eventual park should look like, as far as view corridors and different sort of types of landscape. But he only designed the plantings for along the roadway. And I'll just point out one really interesting element of this is the vast majority of this Parkway section, that's Lake Washington Boulevard today, is one that is very naturalistic, very pastoral, and the lines are organic. But in this area right here, this is the south end of the park, and this whole area outside of the park is residential and small commercial district. You'll notice that the trees are parked right in a line all along that road. And so a much more formal and much less naturalistic design. But as you get into the park, it evolves into a more naturalistic design. And today you can see this. This is in 1934 and then in 2008. Those are the same trees, and they have grown very nicely into that space. And it's a great example of how Olmsted designed not just for the space within the park, but also in the context of this area surrounding it. Another landscape that was worked on early was Volunteer Park. In 1904, we get this preliminary plan on the left, which Volunteer Park is on the top of Capitol Hill. It had amazing views extensively outside of the park at that time. Now you primarily get those through two view corridors, one across the reservoir that you see here, which is one of the design axes of the park, and then another one from the water tower that is located here. But what I'd like to point out to you is that this Ridgeline Drive is one of the few places along a drive in Seattle where the view is intended to be interior to the park. And you see that curve. He did that in that sense that you often see in Central Park, that you can't quite see the end. If you're at either end of this, you can't quite see the end. And so a fairly short concourse, the drive there, actually has that sort of limitless feel that you often see in some of the larger Eastern parks. Other than that, within this park, Olmsted primarily sends the visitor's eyes outside the park. This primary plaza here, this is the museum, well, it's now the museum plaza, then this is a concert grove, looks out over the reservoir and gives a view, which I'll show you in just one second, a little further along in the slideshow. It gives you a view out over the water and out over to the city and the mountains. And then I'll just point out that work did not get started right away. They did some minor grading work in this early years, but then in 1909, they were able to actually really invest in the park, and they invited Olmsted to do another preliminary design with some minor changes. But I'll just show you, this was the view from the water tower. And Olmsted helped the water system, the city water system employees locate the water tower, which was built in order to provide water pressure. Seattle has a gravity-fed water system. And so it needed to be on the highest point, but he located it in such a way that you get amazing views. Even after the trees have grown up in the neighborhood surrounding the park, you can still get spectacular views 360 degrees from the top of the water tower. That reservoir to the left there is the city water system reservoir. And you'll see that throughout Seattle's park system, that the parks and the water system are co-located. That's partly because of the city had purchased that land already for use for the water system just prior to Olmsted's arrival, but it is also because it provides that opportunity for these amazing water features. On the right, you'll see that this is the pergola that Olmsted designed with the concert grove to the right, those curved seats. And this was just a lovely feature that was not built out of concrete. He recommended that it be built out of wood in order to save some early costs. And as a consequence, it did not have that feeling of permanence, and it would be displaced by the Seattle Art Museum, which opened here in 1932, which I'm sad that the pergola is not there, but the Art Museum has brought its own benefits to the park system. I'm sorry, to Volunteer Park. And so it's a win-win in some ways. And one of the other prior purchases of the park system that's associated with the water system is, here's the reservoir here. This is Lincoln Park, which is now known as Cal Anderson Park. You may have heard of this park this summer. This was the site of the Chop Chaz and the protests this summer. And so this has been a well-loved and a really important place in Seattle's history for a long time prior to that, and only more so now. But the reservoir was a water feature in this park's design also. And so you'll see that there is a ball field on the lower part. This whole area is a ball field. This is a pedestrian cross through for the residential zone to go over to the business zone, which was here. And then the view is across where the fountain was in the middle of that reservoir. And you can see those features in this lovely postcard. This is that ball field. And then the water, the reservoir with the gatehouse for that reservoir, and the fountain is in the distance. And so they developed that early on. The preliminary plan is done in 1904, and the park is developed by 1905. And so at the same time that Olmsted is designing some park landscapes for the city. So after the park plan, he did those park landscapes for the city. And he was going back and forth between the East Coast and the West Coast at this time. And at the same time, he's also brought on board by the University of Washington, the Board of Regents, which is separate from the city. They hired the firm to design a plan for the campus, which was located on a hill in the northeast part of the city. You can see this green arrow here. So it's quite some distance from downtown, and at that point, not very developed in its area. The campus itself had been cut over once for the lumber industry, but then sort of had just been allowed to kind of turn into a scrub area. There was second growth timber, lots of underbrush, and the university had just recently moved there in the 1890s, and so had just developed a small area at the north end, which is known as the Fuller Oval, after the engineer who laid out this part. That is this oval with these original university buildings in dark black. And so the university wanted to develop down the hill. This slope goes down. This is the railroad tracks that go around the campus. And then the Lake Washington is right here along the shore. And so they want to develop that, but it's a little bit overwhelming because there is a lot of land that it needs to be graded. It's hard land to grade. And so they get a plan, but they don't actually do very much with it in 1904. And so luckily, another happy stroke of luck, the city of Seattle decides to host the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition in 1909, and they decide to locate it at the University of Washington campus. And therefore, the exposition company hires the Olmsted Brothers firm to lay out the university's plans. And I'm just realizing that I made a mistake in this, so my apologies. These pictures are supposed to be separated. I'm very sorry about that. But I will just say the postcard at the back with the mountain on it is showing the Court of Honors in the foreground, and that genius of place captures that view that goes out toward Mount Rainier and is framed by evergreen trees, and that is still visible. That is still intact on the university campus. If you are ever in Seattle, I highly recommend that you do that. There's lots of views of Mount Rainier in Seattle, but this is a very particularly beautiful one. In the foreground photo there, you can see the formal gardens that he laid out in that vista. And so there's some buildings in the trees, but you see how the view is framed by those evergreens. And then he designed elements like the Dalton Trestle, which is what carried visitors who arrived at the fair via boats on Lake Washington. They walked over the railroad tracks via this very fascinating rustic style trestle that crossed over and helped people get up the hill to the university. And so that all was going on, and James Frederick Dawson, known as Fred Dawson, was the primary Olmsted Brothers staff person on site, and he made a number of acquaintances and worked closely with a lot of private residence projects in Seattle, which really helped the Seattle park systems in some way subsidize the park systems development, because I'm not sure it would have been all that likely that Olmsted would have continued, it would have been feasible to continue coming out here had there not been the promise of those private residence jobs that he acquired all throughout the city and then later expanded throughout the state and up into British Columbia. And so Dawson would be somebody who would be really important in building those relationships. He was much more gregarious than Olmsted. He enjoyed socializing. He ended up marrying a woman from Spokane while he was here. He met her working on a private residence project there. And so he would be important for carrying on the Olmsted planning on site, and also after Olmsted stopped coming to the city in 1913. During these years, we also, this is a very busy time in Seattle's history, we also have annexations going on. And so when Olmsted was here in 1903, we had this sort of central core of the city was part of the city's, within the city limits. Just after he finished that, the city starts acquiring these neighborhoods that are surrounded in green on the north and south sides of the city. And so in 1908, they invite Olmsted back to do another supplemental plan that expanded the original system plan throughout the annexed areas. And so you see these are those large sweeping boulevards that are connecting the large parks throughout the city. And then the small parks are distributed throughout that expanded area. And again, this is Lake Washington, this is Elliott Bay and Puget Sound surrounds the city on this side. And so Seattle gets a much larger park system that they then proceed to develop after that 1908 plan. And by this time, they're able to pass several bond issues and fund quite a bit of construction, acquisition and construction. In 1910, they invite the John Olmsted again to do a playgrounds report. This was less detailed, but equally important because this located and provided guidance on the play fields that were for older kids. You see them here on this truly spectacular piece of playground equipment, terrifying to a mom. But these are for the older kids, those places that'll have field houses and ball fields for older kids where they can't break out windows in the surrounding houses. And the initial push for development of those distributes them throughout the city. This is known as West Seattle here. And so Hiawatha Playfield is there. We have the South Park Playfield, the South Seattle Playfield is here. This is Collins Playfield, and this is the Ballard Playfield. And these are the first ones that are developed in the city. There would later be more. And this is one of my favorite pictures. This shows the playground area of the Hiawatha Playfield in West Seattle. And I'll just point out the plan here on the right. You'll notice that there are these programmed spaces that have very specific uses. And here's the field house. But you'll also notice that there are these beautiful landscaped areas and they wrap around the park. And this is a picture we have from 1925, which is one of my favorite pictures of the park system that we have. It shows kids just enjoying those beautiful spaces that are those oases from the city that we hope for from our parks in the city. And so no park is ever just utilitarian. Olmsted really discouraged the Seattle Park Board from ever getting involved in the schoolyards because those are utilitarian, those are for a very specific purpose. He said anything that's for recreation for kids should also have this aesthetic experience. And so by 1913, what you see is that Seattle has quite a diverse system of parks and parkways. We have Lake Washington Boulevard, which you can see here in the upper left. That is along Lake Washington. And just to the left of where this postcard is from, there is Mount Baker Park. And just in the distance is Coleman Park, which is along the boulevard. And the boulevard continues north along the lakeshore that you can see. On the right-hand side, you can see Washington Park. That is one of the nice little peekaboo views from that park, which is much less formally designed than something like Volunteer Park in the lower right-hand corner. And that's a view that we saw earlier, but just with some color added. And then on the left, you see one of those ravine boulevards. This is Interlaken Boulevard, and it winds its way down through the ravine down toward where Washington Park is on the north side of Capitol Hill. And you see the difference between this boulevard, which has that rustic peeled log infrastructure there, the bridge and the railings, with Lake Washington Boulevard in the top postcard. And that's that difference of, designing so that it will fit into its surroundings. And so the more residential and the more formal of the surrounding landscape is, the more the boulevards were designed in a more formal sense, and the less developed gets the more rustic design. And so here's a map done in 1909 that shows you that quite a bit of the land has been acquired for that park system. It looks pretty familiar to that 1908 plan that we saw. And the ways that the park board was able to develop this much so quickly is that they did not try and fight with where existing development was. They just stayed out of downtown for the most part. They used land that was donated by developers. They'd freely given land to promote development of the neighborhoods that they were building, and they knew it would raise the land values of the houses they were trying to sell. Like I said, they used land already owned by the city. The park system was developed in keeping with the Board of Park Commissioners' priorities, and that's primarily that first view of urban planning that you see. They want to shape how the city develops and attract newcomers. And then open space for children. Throughout the records of the park system that I looked through, there is a real emphasis that not only is Olmsted concerned about space for children to play, but city leaders are and neighborhood development groups are. So not the developers as much as the people who were living in these nascent neighborhoods that really wanted to have beautiful play spaces for their children. And so I'm just going to give you a little tour of the park system because we are just blessed with all of these incredible landscapes. This is Lake Washington Boulevard. You'll see in the upper left what it looked like when it was first developed. And you see that seawall almost like structure, although that is a lake to the right there. And that's one of my favorite Olmsted stories of how you get from that picture in the upper left to the picture in the upper right, which shows all that lawn instead of water. And the way that happened is that the city was selling the lakeshore in this era. And that was because of two things. One, they needed to raise money for that exposition that they were holding at the university campus, but also they were in the process of building or trying desperately to build a ship canal, and that would connect Lake Washington with the saltwater. And they knew that when that ship canal opened, that Lake Washington would be lowered to the same level as the next lake over, which is Lake Union. And so 9 feet of lake level was dropped or was reduced. And so that exposed a significant amount of land. And so they were selling that land speculatively so that it would be developed once it was exposed. And Olmsted took a look at that potential, and he talked to the fellows that he was working with on the park system. And he said, if you get the state to put into that legislation that any land that is adjacent to city-owned land, or any of the shorelands that is adjacent to city-owned land automatically goes to the city for no cost, then you will get tremendously more park land than you would if you had to buy that land. And so the state legislators agree to that. They put that into the legislation. And then property owners along the lakeshore realize that if they donate a strip of land along the lake, a narrow strip in some cases, then they will gain parkland alongside their subdivision. And so they do that. And as a result, the city of Seattle owns most of the lakeshore. Instead of being developed, it is parkland, and it is genius. It's one of my favorite things. And this lower shot just gives you that one of the views of Mount Rainier, although I have to say it must be drawn in here. It's hardly ever that crispy clear. That you get those peekaboo views as you turn corners along the lakeshore on Lake Washington Boulevard. You get those views of Mount Rainier, other Cascade Mountains, the lake itself, and then the forests in the distance. Along Lake Washington Boulevards, there is one section where they had to pull the boulevard up onto the hillside because of prior development. And along that is one of the parks that is sort of the string of pearls along Lake Washington Boulevard, and that is Frink Park. And that land was donated by a park board commissioner. And I just want to show you, this is the bridge that was built in that park to cross the ravine of a creek probably, or a seep that went down the hillside. And Olmsted helped locate this boulevard and helped the engineers understand the principles of carrying the river, or carrying the road through the park. And I marvel at his vision, because this is that park today, or I'm sorry, that bridge today. And it is so beautiful, and it is nestled into the forest that surrounds it. And when you drive along that section of the boulevard, you feel like you're driving through the woods, of course, but then the people that are in the woods are buffered from that traffic that is on that road because of the vegetation that encompasses it. Another park that we have is out in West Seattle. This is known as Schmitz Park. It was set aside in the Olmsted plan because of the amazing forested ravine. There were some very large trees that could not be logged because they couldn't figure out how to get them out of that ravine. And so Olmsted really wanted this to be a rustic park, a park that would capture the forest experience in Seattle, what once had covered all of the slopes of Seattle. And you'll see the rustic furnishings that are there in this park. And it's an interesting little piece of how the life of a park can change so dramatically over the decades. This is the Olmsted plan for the Parkway that comes up from the beach, Alki Beach. It goes through the neighborhood and it comes into the ravine. And there was a turnaround here for vehicles and a pergola here with a comfort station with restrooms. And you see that interesting combination of going from a formal landscape with these trees here that are lined up right along the boulevard into the more naturalistic plantings that are here. And then there's this creek here, and he placed an artificial dam. He had them put logs across. So there's always the sound of running water, which adds to the ambiance and the experience. And this is a beloved park. But over time, this turnaround and the pergola and the comfort station are no longer there. After the war, it became really difficult to maintain. The shift away from having enough staff to have a caretaker at this park was not possible. And so there was lots of vandalism and just issues. And so the park was allowed to revert even more to just a boulevard. And they wanted to run this parkway through the park eventually up to the top of the hill in West Seattle. But it never reached that far. They never developed that part of the park system. And so now you can walk. This road has been vacated and it is just a walkway. And you come to this area and it has been completely replanted in native vegetation. You can, however, still hear a falling water. That has been maintained and it is absolutely magical. Another park that is very different from Schmitz Park, as closed and interior looking as that park is Green Lake Park, which is in the northern part of the city. And this has the walkway that encircles the park, and it is a mob scene. It's almost funny to see a picture with one person, because there's never just one person walking on the trail around Green Lake. And it has been an oasis during the pandemic. Usually bicycles are allowed on half of the path and pedestrians on the other, and they turned it into a one-way pedestrian only path during the pandemic for safety and to continue to keep it open. And so Olmsted, this was originally designed as a boulevard only because the streetcar line went around the lake. And then the park elements, however, that he incorporated into this plan were also developed. And it's not exactly like the Olmsted plan. There have been variations over time, but this is something that it's a very different experience than walking along the shore of Lake Washington, which is an enormous lake. This is a much smaller lake. It's a 3-mile circuit. And this area here is a ball field area. And it's just a really, it's a different variation on water in Seattle, which is interesting because now we will go to Ballard, which is a neighborhood in the northwest part of the city, one of those that was annexed later on after the original report. And this is a view across the saltwater to the Olympic Mountains. And this is a neighborhood park that Olmsted had originally called for it to be 2.5 blocks wide, and then to encompass the entire slope, which is about a 300-foot drop, or maybe closer to 250-foot drop down from this point. And he wanted the whole slope and then 2.5 blocks in from the edge to be part of the park. That wasn't possible for the acquisitions. This is one of the ones that was only partially realized. There is a strip of park that is a 1/2 block wide that runs along the bluff edge, but you see that they got the most spectacular part. This view is amazing, and you can hear the sea lions barking in the distance, and there's a marina just out of sight from this photo down at the base of the bluff. And so you can watch the sailboats coming and going, and then of course the marine traffic. That's Puget Sound there in the distance, and the north-south, that's where the container ships pass through to get to the Port of Seattle. This is Volunteer Park, and this is that view across the water reservoir that I told you about. You can see off in the distance there, this is the Space Needle. We are, I don't think they planned that when they set out the 1962 World's Fair, but we are very lucky that that is right in the axis of the design. And also that view is protected because Lake Union, which is between Volunteer Park and the Space Needle, is sorry, I'm realizing I'm running a little long, so I'm going to talk a little more quickly, but I'll just say that the view is protected because it is a seaplane landing strip on Lake Union. And so that area has to be kept clear for landings and takeoffs. So a lucky, happy coincidence. And this is the water tower on the right that I told you about that offers the 360-degree views for the public. Later on, some of the elements of the park system were developed without direct Olmsted influence. The park department worked with the recommendations in the original reports and in correspondence. This is Magnolia Boulevard, and those are madrona trees that are a Northwest native, and they have a very distinctive sort of architecture to them. And you'll see that Olmsted and the park department never intended this to be a broad view, unimpeded view of the sound. Instead, they wanted it to be a framed view of these trees. These trees have been tortured over the years, however. People have cut them down. They've girdled them so that they have died. And they have been tortured in the last few years with a blight. And so the park department is actually just reinvesting this in the next few years in really trying to get the madrona trees reestablished along this boulevard. And so the goal was to have a park within a 1/2 mile of every home and a playfield within a mile of every home. And it's largely realized. You can see this is a park system map today. This is Olmsted parks and other parks that have been developed since. There's the area north of the city that was annexed in 1953 that you can see. This is Green Lake, and this whole area was annexed after Olmsted was working in the city. And the biggest exception is that we did not get those boulevards, particularly those swooping boulevards that would have connected the southern parts of town. There's a lot of reasons for that. Primarily, though, it's that the Duwamish River Valley really became an industrial area. And so that connectivity was just not a priority. We ended up with 83 parks that have been developed in keeping with the Olmsted Park system. Most of them were done while the Olmsted firm was involved, but there were others that were developed after the war. All the way into the 80s and 90s, there were still land acquisitions according to the goals of the plan. And happily, we've only lost 3 parks. There are 3 playfields: Collins, Mercer, and Southwest. Collins and Southwest playfields were actually replaced with others, not as aesthetically designed, but at least the open space is available. And so just really quickly, I just want to say now the park system in Seattle has its supporters, the Friends of Seattle's Olmsted Parks, works very hard to help support and protect these historic landscapes. The challenges are maintaining these views. Volunteer trees pop up and trees grow bigger, and it gets very hard to maintain those views. We also have a hard time getting the park system to have enough budget to invest in the vegetation and the maintenance of it. It's very labor intensive. And invasive species, particularly blackberries and ivy, are just the bane of our cultural landscapes. And then we also have the issue where Seattle's population is now over 700,000. And to some degree, some of these parks are being loved to death. And so it is very challenging to protect the vegetation and the infrastructure of the parks from just being used to a degree that they get somewhat beat up, and it's hard to keep the lower layers of vegetation alive in some places. And so we are working with the Parks Department to do restoration projects and maintenance projects, and to help kind of ease that cost burden that does come along with these landscapes and maintaining them. The last thing that we're really kind of keeping an eye on and trying to figure out how to adjust to is climate change. That's having a real impact on trees and will continue to. And so how do you plan for that and mitigate for that is things that we are working on with the Parks Department. And so I will end with encouraging you to check out the book. It's at lots of libraries all around the country, happily. You can also check out historylink.org. We are a free online encyclopedia of Washington State history with lots of Olmsted history. SeattleOlmsted.org is the website of the Friends of Seattle's Olmsted Parks, and there's lots of great information and events going on there. And then Dee Dee had mentioned olmstedonline.org, and I will just sing its praises even more. It's been an invaluable tool for me and my research and for us as an advocacy group. But you can find lots more images of the plans of these parks and the parks themselves on Olmsted Online. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm excited for your questions.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. That was just terrific. I think we're all ready just on the East Coast, hop on a plane, and we'll be out there tomorrow and take you up on your tour offer. But it's absolutely gorgeous. And we do have some questions. So let me start with one. Have the parkways been modified greatly to accommodate motor vehicles over the years?
The parkways. They have been in Seattle. We do not have what Olmsted wanted in all cases. They are not as wide as he had hoped. And in some ways that may be good because there was less room to modify them. They had limited lane area anyway. But yes, there has been an impact, particularly Montlake Boulevard has been pretty significantly altered to account for a freeway that was put through. And so the traffic that came with that had to be accommodated. And then the biggest challenge we have is how do you maintain access, but also provide safety? How do you allow bicyclists to have space on a fairly narrow boulevard, but it's so important to still have that bicycle access? And there's different efforts afoot. In Washington Park, they've done some traffic calming measures to try and get people to slow down. And but it's tempting to careen your way along those swooping boulevards. And so those have been the biggest challenges, is how to maintain different ways of accessing it.
Mm-hmm. Well, your question comes from someone in Boston, and they're struggling with absolutely the same challenges. So it's a really interesting question. So can you tell us a little bit about John Charles Olmsted? I mean, obviously he's your guy, but he really isn't very well known in the pantheon of Olmsted landscape architects. So what's your sense? Did he have any particular things that he did that were unlike his brothers and other members of the firm. What's your sense of him after all of this research?
I'm completely smitten with him. He wrote daily letters to his wife that are absolutely charming, and they had such an engaged relationship. Thinking, talking about their family, but also talking about his work. And there's such a diversity of landscapes. It's so hard to really place it in the context and say, this is different. But one of the things that I will say, and I talked a little bit about this, but it can't be emphasized enough, is that he loved the landscape here. He loved the native plants. He was really taken by it. And what you see in Seattle's Olmsted parks that is different than in many other places is that our parks look outward. There are those view corridors, that borrowed landscape where he brings the mountain into the design of the park. And it contrasts most sharply with Prospect Park or Central Park, where the views are within the park and you're encouraged to not gaze outward and take in the city. And we're very lucky with all of those hilltop parks that were acquired. The land was acquired for the water system. And so you get that great view across almost you skim over the city. The city doesn't intrude very much. It's the perfect distance from most of them. So you can enjoy it as a cityscape and not as a bustling metropolis that's bearing down on you. So he really made good use of that. He also incorporated the native plants. He thought salal, which is one of my favorite plants here in Seattle and Washington, and he thought when it rustled, it sounded like linen. And he couldn't understand why people wanted to replace it with lawn. He wanted even the formalist households in Seattle to use salal instead of lawn. He never successfully got anybody to do that, but they wanted their lawns. But it's interesting to hear him talk about that. And I think that he's less well known because he wasn't terribly gregarious. He didn't love chatting with strangers and much preferred to be doing his work. But the people that he worked with in Seattle, he had very long-term relationships with. He corresponded with them. And so he clearly cared very deeply about the landscape here and the way the city was growing.
Mm-hmm. And here's a more specific question about what is the CBC on those gold boxes that were in one of your earliest photographs?
Let me think what that would have been. It would have been Canadian something. CBC. I don't know. I'll have to look that up. But it was most likely the transportation, something related to the transportation. But I'm not sure. Something of Canada or Canadian something. Have to look. That's a good question.
You mentioned obviously the protests and some of the social unrest this summer. I mean, how have the parks adapted to that? How has that weighed upon the design of the parks and the desired use of the parks? How has the city responded?
It's been hard. I remember the first day I saw that in Cal Anderson Park, which was Lincoln Park in the early designs, the reservoir was replaced with a structure that is cone shaped and has a water feature, and the above ground elements when the reservoir was put underground, and that was graffitied. The whole thing just completely graffitied. And at first I was just like, and when I saw the picture of it, but then the thing that I took away with is this is so important. This is not, we have lots of protests in Seattle. It's a thing we do. And this felt so much more than that. And so as much as I worried about the park, I also worried about the people and what were people trying to express. And so happily, the city took that tact also. They were not dismissing the need to protect the park, but they were also taking into account that people were trying to tell us something. Mm-hmm. And so there were lots of meetings. There still are ongoing meetings about how do we ensure that people have space to gather, that they're not, that it can be accommodated. There has always been that space in Cal Anderson Park, but there needs to be more and in different configurations maybe. And then, but how do you protect those Olmsted elements that have served the community for more than 100 years, 115 years? And so it's been an interesting discussion in historic preservation versus how do you evolve to meet community needs? And the other issue that's really been a challenging one this year is homeless encampments. Again, you worry deeply for the people that are living in tents, but you also worry for the park landscapes that are being impacted. And that's an ongoing problem also.
And can you tell us a little bit about the Seattle Task Force, the Olmsted Legacy Task Force, and some of its plans and what that might offer for other cities that are thinking about their Olmsted parks?
That has been an exciting process, slow moving, as often is the case, and the pandemic certainly didn't help that. But the impetus for that was that we in Seattle implemented or voted for a Metropolitan Park District 6 years ago now, I think. And that changed the governing of the park system, but also the funding of it. And it provided the opportunity to have different revenue streams and a little bit more stability in those revenue streams for the maintenance and development of the park system. And so one of the things that we advocated for successfully was a fund within that would be put just toward historic landscape preservation and restoration. And so then the question arises is, where do you spend that money? And the Olmsted Task Force comes out of that desire to sort of think about what is the meaning of our historic park system, what is the what needs to be done in order to protect and advance it, and also to look forward to those parts of the city that were not part of the system when Olmsted was here. How do you extend that capturing of genius of place and that access to those neighborhoods, which have always been a little more ad hoc in their park development? And so the task force convened members of all different stakeholders, users of the park system. And we talked about what is the Olmsted Legacy? What does that even mean? And what are the challenges the park system faces in trying to meet the needs of that historic park system? And how might those needs be met in creative ways? And how might city departments communicate more effectively? Because some are park system owned and some are managed with the Department of Transportation. And so you have a lot of need. The Seattle Public Utilities has some overlap. And so how do you look at all those things? And so the report that we came up with provides some guidance and hopefully will lead to we really, really would love to see at least a part-time staff person in the park department that knows the history, knows historic preservation, and what that even looks like. You know, there's a sense that it's freezing things in amber, which of course is impossible with a park system. Landscapes change, they grow, they age out. What do you do when trees get older and need to be replaced? And so I still hope that that will come to fruition. It's hard to say with the world we're in. But yes, I encourage anybody who's interested for their community to reach out to the Friends of Seattle's Olmsted Parks. We would be happy to provide more background on that.
And we have a link to the task force report actually on the Olmsted 200 website. So we
Great.
Make it available there. And we're going to end on two little easier questions for you. First one is, would FLO have approved of the Space Needle?
Oh, that's so interesting because there's other places where a beautiful floating bridge is in the view of the boulevard. And what would Olmsted say about that? And I don't know, it is a bit intrusive, but you do have the cityscape there. So it's not like it's a pristine view. So I don't know. It's beautiful at night.
And your last question tonight is, what is your favorite park? So that when we come to visit momentarily, which one should we go visit first?
Oh my goodness. So that's like asking your favorite child. So I will hedge a little bit and say it's a string of Olmsted landscapes. It's the Jefferson Park, and then you go down Beacon Avenue, which is a park boulevard, to Cheesty Boulevard, which goes through a ravine, down to the Mount Baker neighborhood, which is a residential parkway, down to Lake Washington Boulevard. And then you can go north or south and take in the Lake Washington Boulevard and those lovely parks. So that continuity and variety of experiences is just spectacular. So It's a little hedge, but it's a unit.
Well, it has been such a lovely evening being introduced to Olmsted in Seattle. We really enjoyed it, Jennifer. Thank you so much for the presentation. And as I say, I hope everyone will go out and buy Olmsted in Seattle for your library. It's a wonderful book. And I want to say thank you also to Victoria Van Huss, NAOP's communications specialist, who's been with us this evening, and wish you all a very good evening. So thanks again, Jennifer. Really appreciate it. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Good night, everyone.
I have to figure out how to leave.
There we go. Thanks again, Jennifer. It was wonderful.
Yeah,
Really
yeah.
appreciate it.
Thank you.